The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge when Sarah Mitchell first heard the impossible story. She stood behind the counter of her general store, measuring out flour for Mrs. Henderson's weekly order, when the saloon doors burst open with a crash that made every person on the street turn and stare. Out stumbled Jake Morrison, the town drunk who hadn't been sober for 3 straight days in anyone's memory. But this morning, his eyes held a clarity that Sarah had never seen before, wide with terror and something else she couldn't quite place. His clothes were torn, his hands shaking as he pointed back toward the saloon. "He did it!" Jake stammered, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "That stranger, he actually did it. I saw him myself, saw what he was eating." Mrs. Henderson clicked her tongue in disapproval. "That man's been drinking rot-gut whiskey since before dawn. Don't pay him no mind, Sarah." But Sarah found herself stepping out from behind the counter, drawn by something in Jake's voice that she'd never heard before. Fear, yes, but also a kind of stunned reverence that made the hair on her arms stand up. "What did he do, Jake?" she called out, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's disapproving glare. Jake's weathered face turned toward her, and she could see that his usual alcoholic flush had been replaced by an ashen pallor. "The shadow cat," he whispered, loud enough for half the street to hear. "The stranger killed the shadow cat, and he's in there right now, eating it like it was nothing more than Sunday dinner." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children who had been playing in the dust froze where they stood. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden tension, stamping their feet and snorting nervously. Sarah felt her own disbelief rise like bile in her throat. The shadow cat had terrorized this territory for longer than anyone could remember. It was a creature of legend and nightmare, standing taller than a grown man when it reared up on its hind legs, with claws that could slice through tree trunks and eyes that glowed like amber coals in the darkness. For 20 years, it had claimed lives across 3 counties. Ranchers, travelers, even armed posses had fallen to its impossible speed and cunning. "That's impossible," she heard herself say, but even as the words left her mouth, she remembered the stranger who had ridden into town 3 days ago. He had been unlike any man she'd ever seen. Not particularly tall or broad, but there was something about the way he moved that reminded her of water, flowing over rocks, effortless and inevitable. His skin was weathered dark by sun and wind, and his black hair hung loose to his shoulders in the Apache way, though his features suggested he was only part Indian. He had spoken little, purchasing only basic supplies and asking quiet questions about the territory. Most unsettling of all were his eyes. They held a depth that seemed ancient, as if they had seen things that would break lesser men. When he had looked at her across the counter of her store, she had felt like he was reading something written in her soul. "Where is he now?" Sarah found herself asking, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Jake pointed a trembling finger toward the saloon. "Still in there. Told everyone to leave him be while he finished his meal. Said he had business to discuss with the town afterward." Sheriff Coleman pushed through the gathering crowd, his star glinting in the morning light. He was a good man, Sarah knew, but he had the soft look of someone who had never faced real danger. The worst crime in Copper Ridge in the past 5 years had been cattle rustling. "This is nonsense," Coleman declared, adjusting his gun belt in a way that suggested he was more nervous than he wanted to admit. "The shadow cat's just a story parents tell to keep their children from wandering off after dark." An old Apache woman who sometimes came to town to trade jerky and leather goods stepped forward from the crowd. Sarah had never heard her speak much English, but now she looked directly at the sheriff with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Not story," she said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "My people, we know. Shadow Walker been here since my grandmother's grandmother. Kills when moon is dark, takes strong men, leaves only bones picked clean." The sheriff's face flushed red. "I don't have time for Indian superstitions." "Then explain the missing cattle," called out Tom Bradley, who owned the largest ranch in the county. "Explain why my best bull was found last month with its throat torn out and half the meat missing. Explain why 3 of my ranch hands quit after they found tracks bigger than dinner plates leading up into the mountains." Sarah watched the sheriff's confidence crumble as more voices joined the chorus. Everyone had stories. Livestock found mutilated. Travelers who never reached their destinations. Strange sounds in the night that made brave men bar their doors and pray for dawn. The saloon doors swung open again, and this time the stranger himself stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent so quickly that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. He looked exactly as she remembered, except now there was something different about him. A satisfaction, perhaps, or the quiet contentment of someone who had finished a long and difficult task. He carried a small leather pouch in one hand, and what appeared to be a piece of carved bone in the other. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "Mister, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this town doesn't appreciate troublemakers." The stranger's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed the way his stance shifted almost imperceptibly. She had seen cats prepare to spring with less coiled tension. "No game, Sheriff. No trouble either if you're willing to listen." He held up the carved bone, and Sarah could see now that it was a claw, yellowed with age and longer than her middle finger. "This belonged to the creature your people call the Shadow Cat. I have ended its reign over this territory." "Prove it," demanded Tom Bradley, though he stayed well back in the crowd. "If you really killed that thing, prove it." The stranger reached into the leather pouch and withdrew something that made several women in the crowd gasp and step backward. It was a tuft of fur, but unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it, creating a patch of darkness that hurt to look at directly. "The Shadow Cat was ancient," the stranger said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a sacred story. "Older than your settlements, older than the Apache who first named it. It was the last of its kind, a creature from the time when the world was younger and wilder." He began to walk slowly down the middle of the street, and the crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. It had grown lazy over the years, too accustomed to easy prey. Last night, it made the mistake of stalking someone who knew how to hunt it back. Sarah found herself drawn forward despite every instinct telling her to run. There was something mesmerizing about the way he spoke, as if his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "You're Apache," she said, not really meaning to speak aloud. He turned those ancient eyes toward her and nodded once. "Among other things. My grandmother was Chiricahua. She taught me the old ways before she died, including how to hunt creatures that most people believe are only legends." "And now you've eaten it," Jake Morrison added, his voice still shaky with disbelief. "I have honored it," the stranger corrected gently. "In my grandmother's tradition, to consume the flesh of a worthy adversary is to take its strength and speed into yourself. The Shadow Cat lived for perhaps 200 years. It deserves to become part of something greater than itself." Sheriff Coleman had been growing red-faced during this exchange. "This is all nonsense," he declared. "I don't care if you're Apache, Mexican, or the King of England. You can't just walk into my town claiming to have killed some mythical beast." The stranger stopped walking and turned to face the sheriff directly. "You're right to be skeptical," he said calmly. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof." From somewhere inside his coat, he produced a rolled piece of hide and handed it to the sheriff. Coleman unrolled it with obvious reluctance, and Sarah watched his face go white as he stared at whatever was drawn there. "This is a map," Coleman said, his voice barely above a whisper. It shows every attack site for the past 10 years. 15 years, the stranger corrected. I've been tracking the Shadow Cat for a very long time. Every kill, every sighting, every piece of evidence. Last night, I finally cornered it in the caves above Broken Creek. Tom Bradley pushed forward to look at the hide map. These locations, some of these I never reported. How could you know about the cattle I lost 2 springs ago in the high pasture? Because I've made it my life's work to know, the stranger replied. The Shadow Cat was my responsibility. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Your responsibility? For the first time since she'd met him, the stranger's composure seemed to crack slightly. Pain flickered across his features, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. My younger brother was its first victim in this territory, he said quietly. 23 years ago, he was 16, riding alone to visit his sweetheart in the next valley. They found pieces of him scattered across half a mile of canyon floor. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. I swore on his bones that I would track the creature responsible and make it pay for what it had taken from my family. It has taken me more than 2 decades to learn enough about the Shadow Cat to have any hope of facing it successfully. Mrs. Henderson, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, stepped forward from the crowd. What do you want from us, young man? The stranger looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. Nothing more than to let you know that you're safe now. Your children can play in the woods without fear. Your livestock can graze in the high pastures. Travelers can ride the mountain paths after dark without looking over their shoulders. And you? Sarah found herself asking. What will you do now? He turned back to her, and she saw something she hadn't expected in those ancient eyes. Uncertainty. For all his confidence in tracking and killing legendary beasts, he seemed genuinely lost when it came to the question of what came next. I honestly don't know, he admitted. For more than 20 years, every decision I've made, every skill I've learned, every path I've chosen has been in service of this single goal. Now that it's accomplished, his voice trailed off, and Sarah felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this strange man who had walked into their town carrying death and legend in equal measure. Sheriff Coleman rolled up the hide map and handed it back. I suppose if you really did kill this thing, the county owes you a debt of gratitude. I didn't do it for gratitude, the stranger said. I did it because it was my duty. Even so, Coleman continued, if you're looking for a place to settle down, Copper Ridge could use a man with your particular skills. We don't have much trouble with legendary beasts, but there are plenty of ordinary problems that could benefit from someone who knows how to track things. Sarah watched the stranger consider this offer, seeing the war between uncertainty and possibility playing out across his features. She realized that she very much wanted him to say yes, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Think about it, she heard herself saying. At least stay long enough to rest from your hunt. You've earned that much. He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt that same sensation of being read like an open book. This time, however, it didn't frighten her. Instead, it made her want to know what story he saw written there. Perhaps I will, he said finally. My name is Marcus Running Wolf, and yes, I would welcome a chance to rest. As the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their daily routines with the strange lightness of those who have just learned they're safer than they thought, Sarah found herself still standing in the dusty street, watching this man who had killed legends and eaten them like ordinary game. She had no way of knowing that her life had just taken a turn toward something extraordinary, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, about love, and about the thin line between civilization and the wild places where ancient things still hunted under the stars. All she knew was that Marcus Running Wolf had brought something into her world that felt like the promise of adventure, and despite every sensible voice in her head telling her to be careful, she found herself hoping he would decide to stay. 3 days had passed since Marcus Running Wolf's extraordinary revelation, and Sarah Mitchell found herself watching the saloon doors more often than she cared to admit. Each morning brought a strange mix of normalcy and anticipation to Copper Ridge, as if the entire town was holding its breath waiting for something to happen. The change in people's behavior was subtle but unmistakable. Children who had previously been called inside before sunset now played in the streets well past dark. Tom Bradley had moved his cattle to the high pastures he'd avoided for years. Even old Doc Peterson had started making house calls to the isolated homesteads in the foothills, something he'd refused to do for the better part of a decade. But it was Marcus himself who occupied Sarah's thoughts most persistently. He had taken a room at the boarding house and spent his days walking the town's perimeter with the methodical thoroughness of someone accustomed to studying his environment. She had watched him from her store window, noting the way he paused to examine tracks in the mud, the way his head tilted when listening to sounds that others couldn't hear. On the 4th morning, he finally entered her store. "Miss Mitchell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that spoke of careful upbringing despite his rough appearance. "Mr. Running Wolf," she replied, setting down the inventory ledger she'd been pretending to read. "What can I help you with today?" Instead of browsing the shelves as most customers did, he approached the counter directly and placed a small doeskin pouch beside the cash register. "I'd like to purchase writing materials," he said. "Paper, ink, something suitable for correspondence." Sarah gathered the requested items, stealing glances at his face as she worked. In daylight, without the drama of his first appearance, she could see details she'd missed before. There were small scars along his jawline that suggested old knife fights. His hands, when he reached for the paper, showed calluses in places that spoke of years handling weapons and tools. "May I ask what you're writing?" she said, then immediately felt her cheeks flush. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "A letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs," he said without hesitation, "and another to the territorial governor. They should know that the threat is ended." Sarah nodded, though she found herself wondering what kind of man thought to notify government officials about the death of a creature most people considered mythical. "There's something else," Marcus continued, and she heard a note of hesitation in his voice for the first time. "I was wondering if you might recommend someone who could help me understand the local land laws." "Land laws?" The question caught her off guard. Sheriff Coleman's offer got me thinking. "If I'm going to stay in this area, I should probably establish some kind of legal residence." He paused, studying her face with those unsettling eyes. "Unless you think that's a poor idea." Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said, then immediately worried she'd sounded too eager. "I mean, the town could certainly benefit from having someone with your experience nearby." "My experience," he repeated, and there was something bitter in his tone. 23 years of learning how to kill things that shouldn't exist. I'm not sure how much of that translates to peaceful settlement life." "You'd be surprised," Sarah said, moving around the counter to face him directly. "There are plenty of ordinary dangers that require the same skills. Wild animals, bandits, harsh weather, and—" She hesitated, then decided to be bold. "Sometimes people need someone who understands that the world is bigger and stranger than they thought." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt that familiar sensation of being read like text on a page. But this time, she met his gaze steadily, letting him see whatever he was looking for. "You're not afraid of me," he observed, though it sounded more like a question. "Should I be? Most people are, once they really understand what I've done, what I've had to become to do it." He gestured toward the window, where they could see the normal bustle of daily life. These people live in a world where problems have ordinary solutions. They can't quite grasp what it means to spend decades learning how to think like a predator. Sarah considered this, remembering her own reaction when she'd first heard his story. The disbelief, yes, but also something else. A kind of recognition that she'd been too startled to examine at the time. "My father was a buffalo hunter," she said quietly. "Before the herds disappeared, before he settled here and opened this store. I grew up hearing his stories about tracking wounded bulls for days across empty prairie, about learning to read signs so subtle that other hunters thought it was magic." She moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful street. "He told me once that the thing that made him successful wasn't his skill with a rifle. It was his willingness to become something other than civilized when the situation demanded it. To think like the animal he was hunting." When she turned back, Marcus was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. And he would have understood what you did, I think. The dedication it required. The sacrifice. She met his eyes again. The loneliness. The word hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite sure they should cross. "It has been lonely," Marcus admitted finally. "More than I realized until I stopped moving long enough to notice." Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the door jangled, and Mrs. Henderson bustled in, her usual purposeful energy filling the small space. "Oh," she said, stopping short when she saw Marcus. "I didn't realize you had a customer, dear." "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption and annoyed by it in equal measure. "Mr. Winnie, Running Wolf was just purchasing some writing supplies." The older woman looked between them with shrewd eyes. Mrs. Henderson had been the town's informal matchmaker for as long as Sarah could remember, and she clearly sensed undercurrents that made her perk up with interest. "How lovely. And how are you settling in, Mr. Running Wolf? I imagine it must be quite an adjustment after your previous lifestyle." "It's peaceful," Marcus said diplomatically. "I'm still learning what that feels like." Mrs. Henderson beamed at him. "Well, if you're looking for ways to integrate into the community, you should know that we're having a barn raising next Saturday at the Peterson place. The whole town turns out for those. Good food, good company, and a chance to meet everyone properly." Sarah watched Marcus consider this invitation, seeing the war between inclination and uncertainty play out across his features. "I'm not sure I'd fit in at a community gathering," he said carefully. "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson declared, with the confidence of someone who had never met a social problem she couldn't solve. "Sarah here will introduce you around, won't you, dear?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm again. "Of course, if you'd like me to." "It's settled then," Mrs. Henderson announced, as if the matter had never been in doubt. "Sarah, you can pick him up at the boarding house. Say around noon?" As Mrs. Henderson continued chattering about the details of the barn raising, Sarah found herself watching Marcus's reaction. He looked like a man who had just been swept up in a current he hadn't expected, but wasn't entirely sure he wanted to escape. After Mrs. Henderson finally left with her purchases, Sarah and Marcus stood in awkward silence for a moment. "You don't have to go," Sarah said finally. "She means well, but she can be rather overwhelming." "No, she's right," Marcus said, surprising her. "If I'm going to stay here, I need to become part of the community, and—" He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'd welcome your company, if the offer was genuine." "It was," Sarah assured him, feeling an unexpected flutter of anticipation. "Then I'll see you Saturday at noon." After he left, Sarah found herself staring at the door long after it had closed behind him. She was still standing there when her younger sister Emma burst through the back entrance, her arms full of packages from her shopping trip to the next town over. "Was that the famous monster hunter?" Emma asked without preamble. At 19, she had their father's directness and their mother's complete lack of patience for social niceties. "His name is Marcus," Sarah said, moving to help with the packages. "Marcus, then. Were you two making cow eyes at each other? Because from where I was standing outside, it certainly looked like it." "Emma, I'm just saying, you've had that dreamy expression ever since he rode into town. And don't think I haven't noticed you watching the street every time you hear hoofbeats." Sarah busied herself with unpacking supplies, hoping her sister wouldn't notice her blush. "He's an interesting person. He's had experiences most people can't imagine." Emma's tone suggested she wasn't buying the casual deflection. "And he's handsome in that dangerous, mysterious way that makes sensible women do foolish things." "I'm not doing anything foolish. Yet," Emma added cheerfully, "but Saturday's barn raising should be interesting. Half the unmarried women in 3 counties will be there, and now they'll all want to meet the man who killed the legendary Shadow Cat." Sarah felt an unexpected stab of jealousy at the thought. She hadn't considered that other women might be interested in Marcus, though it seemed obvious now that Emma mentioned it. "It doesn't matter," she said, more to convince herself than her sister. "He's probably just being polite. After what he's been through, the last thing he wants is romantic complications." Emma gave her a look of pure skepticism. "Sarah, I may be younger than you, but I'm not blind. That man didn't look at you the way someone looks at a polite shopkeeper. He looked at you the way someone looks at a person they're trying to figure out." "Meaning what?" "Meaning he's just as interested as you are, but he's being careful about it." Emma settled onto a stool behind the counter, clearly prepared to continue this conversation at length. "Think about it. He spent more than 20 years focused on one single goal. Now that goal is accomplished, and he's probably feeling lost, but he's also free for the first time in his adult life to think about things like companionship and settling down." Sarah considered this perspective, remembering the uncertainty she'd seen in Marcus's eyes when discussing his future. "And you think he's considering those possibilities with me?" "I think he's a man who's survived by being very careful about who he trusts," Emma said. "The fact that he's comfortable talking to you, that he accepted your invitation to the barn raising, suggests he sees something in you worth exploring." Before Sarah could respond, the bell jangled again, and Tom Bradley entered, his hat in his hands and an expression of nervous determination on his face. "Miss Mitchell," he said formally, "I was hoping to speak with your friend, the Apache fellow." "Mr. Running Wolf?" Sarah corrected automatically. "He's not here at the moment. Is there something I can help you with?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's like this. I've been thinking about what he said, about how he tracked that creature for so many years. And I've got a problem that might benefit from someone with those kinds of skills." Emma leaned forward with interest. "What kind of problem?" "Horse thieves," Tom said bluntly. "Lost 6 head last week, and Sheriff Coleman can't track them worth a damn. No offense to the man, but his skills run more toward keeping drunk cowboys from shooting up the saloon." Sarah nodded. Everyone in town knew that Coleman was better suited to maintaining order than pursuing criminals across rough country. "You want Mr. Running Wolf to track the thieves," she said. "If he's willing, I can pay good money for the service, and it would give him a chance to show folks what he can do with more ordinary problems." Tom's expression grew earnest. "Truth is, Miss Mitchell, I think having someone like him working in the territory would be good for all of us. Word gets around that we've got a tracker who can follow sign like an Apache and kill legendary beasts for breakfast, and maybe the criminal element will think twice about operating in our area." Sarah found herself smiling at the image of Marcus's growing reputation serving as a deterrent to ordinary criminals. "I'll mention it to him when I see him next," she promised. "Much obliged," Tom said, settling his hat back on his head. You might also mention that if he's interested in doing this kind of work regular-like, I'd be willing to put together a group of ranchers who could keep him busy. We've all got problems that could benefit from his particular talents. After Tom left, Sarah found herself thinking about the implications of his offer. If Marcus decided to stay in the area, he wouldn't lack for work, and work meant roots, connections, reasons to remain in one place. "See?" Emma said, correctly reading her expression. "He's not going anywhere, and neither are you, apparently. So the question is what you're going to do about this mutual attraction." Sarah looked out the window toward the boarding house where Marcus was presumably writing his letters to government officials, and felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Sarah had spent longer than usual getting ready, changing her dress twice before settling on the blue calico that Emma insisted brought out her eyes. She told herself she was just being neighborly, but the flutter in her stomach suggested otherwise. When she knocked on the boarding house door at precisely noon, Marcus answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting nearby. He had cleaned up considerably since their first meeting, his hair neatly braided and his clothes freshly laundered, though he still wore the practical leather and denim of a man accustomed to outdoor work. "You look very nice," he said, and Sarah felt pleased by the genuine appreciation in his voice. "Thank you. So do you." She gestured toward the wagon she'd borrowed from the stable. "Ready to face Copper Ridge society?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he said, though she caught a hint of nervousness beneath his calm exterior. The ride to the Peterson place took 20 minutes through countryside that was beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. They talked easily about practical things at first, the weather and the approaching harvest season, but gradually the conversation turned more personal. "Have you been to many barn raisings?" Sarah asked as they crested a hill that gave them their first view of the gathering below. "None," Marcus admitted. "My lifestyle hasn't included many community events." Sarah looked at the scene spread out before them. 36 people were already at work, the men wrestling with heavy timber while the women organized food and supervised children who darted between the adults like busy ants. It occurred to her how strange this must look to someone accustomed to solitude. "It can be overwhelming at first," she said gently, "but everyone genuinely wants to help. It's what makes a community work." Marcus studied the organized chaos with the same intensity she'd seen him apply to examining tracks. "In Apache culture, we have similar gatherings, but they're usually for specific ceremonies or seasonal preparations. This seems different." "Different how?" "Less formal, more joyful, perhaps." He glanced at her. "Your people seem to genuinely enjoy each other's company." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunshine. "We do, and you're one of our people now, whether you realize it or not." When they arrived at the work site, Tom Bradley was the first to approach them, his face lighting up with obvious relief. "Running Wolf, perfect timing. We could use someone who knows how to handle himself around heavy timber." Within minutes, Marcus had been absorbed into the work crew, his natural competence and quiet strength making him a welcome addition to the raising effort. Sarah watched him adapt to the rhythm of community labor, noting how quickly the other men accepted his presence. She joined the women organizing the midday meal, but found herself stealing glances toward the construction site more often than she should have. Emma, who had arrived earlier with friends, appeared at her elbow with a knowing smile. "He fits in better than you expected," Emma observed, following Sarah's gaze to where Marcus was helping maneuver a support beam into position. "He does," Sarah agreed, surprised by how natural he looked working alongside the other men. "The Peterson girls have been asking about him," Emma added with obvious mischief. "And Mary Collins made a point of mentioning that she'd brought extra pie." Sarah felt that same stab of jealousy she'd experienced earlier in the week. The Peterson sisters were both pretty and single, and Mary Collins was known for her cooking skills. "He's free to talk to whoever he chooses," Sarah said, trying to sound indifferent. "True," Emma replied, "but he keeps looking over here at you, not at them." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion broke out near the construction site. She turned to see Sheriff Coleman approaching on horseback, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Tom Bradley," Coleman called out. "Need to talk to you." The work stopped as people gathered to hear what had brought the sheriff out on a Saturday afternoon. Tom wiped his hands on his pants and approached Coleman's horse. "What's the trouble, Sheriff?" "Those horse thieves struck again. Hit the Morrison spread this time. Took 8 head, including that stallion Jake was so proud of." Coleman's expression was grim. "Found tracks leading north toward the Badlands, but they've got at least a day's head start." Sarah watched Marcus step forward from the group of workers, his entire posture changing as he shifted into what she was beginning to recognize as his hunting mode. "How many riders?" Marcus asked quietly. "Hard to say," Coleman replied. "Ground's pretty torn up. Maybe 4 or 5. "And they're heading for the Badlands," Marcus said, more to himself than to the sheriff. "That suggests they know the territory well enough to use it for cover." Tom Bradley turned to face Marcus directly. "You willing to track them?" Sarah saw Marcus hesitate, glancing toward her as if seeking permission. She nodded slightly, understanding that this was his chance to prove himself in the ordinary world of their community. "I'll need to leave immediately if we're going to have any chance of catching them before they reach the Deep Canyon country," Marcus said. "But yes, I'll track them." "I'm coming with you," Tom declared, but Marcus shook his head. "I work better alone, especially on a trail this cold, but I'll need someone to meet me with fresh supplies in 3 days at Widow's Rock if I'm not back by then." Sheriff Coleman looked relieved to have someone competent taking charge. "What do you need from us?" "Just stay out of the area so you don't muddy the trail any further." Marcus was already moving toward the horses, his mind clearly shifting to the task ahead. "And have a deputy ready to process prisoners when I bring them back." Sarah found herself following him, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "Marcus!" she called, and he turned back to her with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "This isn't the same as hunting the shadow cat," she said, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to say it. "These are just ordinary criminals." "I know." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "But it's still dangerous work, and there are no guarantees." The unspoken message hung between them, the acknowledgement that he might not return, that this budding connection between them might end before it had a chance to grow. Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. "Then you better come back," she said, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek quickly. "We have a conversation to finish." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then smiled in a way that transformed his entire face. "Yes, we do," he agreed. "Wait for me." "I will." Sarah watched him ride north at a ground-eating lope that spoke of years spent covering vast distances efficiently. The barn raising resumed around her, but she found it difficult to focus on the work, her attention constantly drifting toward the distant hills where Marcus had disappeared. Emma appeared beside her again. "Now that was romantic," she said approvingly. "Very dramatic and frontier-like." "I hope he comes back safely," Sarah said, realizing how much truth those words contained. "He will," Emma assured her with the confidence of youth. "Men like that don't get killed by ordinary horse thieves." The rest of the barn raising passed in a blur of activity and worried speculation about the theft ring that had been plaguing the territory. By evening, when the structure stood complete and the celebration was winding down, Sarah found herself scanning the northern horizon, hopefully despite knowing it was far too early for Marcus to return. 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah threw herself into work at the store, but found her mind wandering constantly to wonder where Marcus was, whether he had found the thieves, whether he was safe. The third night, she barely slept, lying awake listening to every sound outside her window. On the fourth morning, Emma burst into the store with news that made Sarah's heart leap. "They're back," Emma announced breathlessly. "Marcus and the prisoners. They're riding down Main Street right now." Sarah dropped the inventory ledger and rushed outside to join the crowd that was already gathering. She could see Marcus approaching at the head of a small procession that included 4 sullen-looking men with their hands tied behind their backs and a string of recovered horses. He looked tired, but uninjured, his clothes dusty from hard travel, but his posture still straight and confident. When he spotted Sarah in the crowd, his face lit up with a smile that made her knees weak. Sheriff Coleman hurried forward to take custody of the prisoners, but Sarah heard fragments of the conversation as Marcus briefly outlined what had happened. "Caught them holed up in Dead Man's Canyon," Marcus was saying. "They'd been using that area as a base for months, stealing horses and cattle from across 3 counties and selling them to buyers in Mexico." "Any trouble taking them?" Coleman asked. "Some." Marcus's smile turned grim. "They weren't expecting to be tracked by someone who knew how to read sign in rock country. I had the advantage of surprise." Tom Bradley pushed through the crowd, beaming with satisfaction. "Outstanding work, Running Wolf. Every single horse recovered and the thieves in custody. I'd say you've earned your fee and then some." As the crowd began to disperse and the prisoners were led toward the jail, Marcus finally made his way to where Sarah was standing. He looked at her with an expression that mixed relief with something deeper. "You waited," he said simply. "I said I would." "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his saddlebags to withdraw a small object wrapped in soft leather. "I found it in their camp." Sarah unwrapped the leather to reveal a beautiful turquoise pendant on a silver chain, clearly Apache craftwork of exceptional quality. "It's gorgeous," she breathed. "But shouldn't it be returned to whoever they stole it from?" "It wasn't stolen," Marcus said quietly. "It belonged to my grandmother. She made it, and my mother wore it until the day she died. I've been looking for it for 15 years. Sarah stared at him in amazement. "How did you know it was there?" "I didn't. But finding it feels like a sign, maybe. That it's time to stop running from the past and start building something new." He took the pendant from her hands and stepped behind her to fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin as he worked the clasp, and Sarah felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "I want to stay," Marcus said, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulders. "In Copper Ridge, I mean. Tom's offered me regular work, and Sheriff Coleman thinks the territorial government might be interested in hiring me as a special tracker." Sarah turned within the circle of his arms to face him. "And personally? What do you want personally?" "I want to see where this leads," he said, gesturing between them. "I've spent so many years focused on death and vengeance that I'd forgotten what it felt like to think about life and hope. And now you remember?" "Now I remember," he confirmed, his dark eyes warm with possibility. "You make me remember what it feels like to want something other than justice for the past." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotions she'd been afraid to examine too closely. "I want to see where this leads to," she admitted. Marcus leaned down to kiss her properly this time, and Sarah felt the last of her uncertainty dissolve. Around them, the normal bustle of Copper Ridge continued, but for Sarah, the world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this unexpected chance at happiness. When they finally broke apart, Emma's voice called out cheerfully from the store doorway. "Should I start planning a wedding? Or are you two going to stand in the street making moon eyes at each other all day?" Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Give us time to figure things out, Emma." "Time we have," Marcus said, his arm settling comfortably around Sarah's waist. For the first time in more than 20 years, I have all the time in the world. As they walked toward the store together, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. A week ago, she had been a spinster shopkeeper in a quiet frontier town, her biggest excitement the arrival of new inventory. Now she was wearing her grandmother's turquoise pendant, given to her by a man who had killed legends and chosen to stay for love. The shadow cat was dead, the horse thieves were captured, and Marcus Running Wolf had found a new purpose that had nothing to do with hunting and everything to do with building a life worth living. Sarah had thought disbelief was the strongest emotion she could feel about the impossible story of a man who had dined on a territory's unchallenged killer. But she had been wrong. The strongest emotion was hope, bright and fierce and completely unexpected, filling her heart with the promise of adventures yet to come. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories were not about ending terrible things, but about the courage to begin beautiful ones.